2, 3, 4.
Welcome to Don't Do That, the podcast where we talk about what not to do at work and beyond.
As equity practitioners, we found ourselves often thinking that folks should stop doing things before they start doing things. Hence the title of our podcast, Don't Do That. I'm Anee. I'm an equity coach, organizational equity strategist, and educator with a deep curiosity for how to improve systems and a commitment to lift others as I continue to learn and grow.
I'm Karen, and I've worked in social justice for over a decade. I'm a consultant, coach, and thought partner. My purpose is to make community matter. I do that by helping leaders create better work environments. Anee and I met as consultants and quickly became friends. Collectively, we have over 25 years of experience navigating equity, inclusion, and justice in the workplace. Don't Do That is a platform to tell stories about making mistakes at work and how to fix them. The views on this podcast are our own. We do not speak on behalf of our organizations or the communities we mention.
Okay, welcome listeners to this week's episode of Don't Do That. Today we are discussing racism at work, specifically for Black professionals. So we are diving right into all of the ways that anti-Blackness shows up at work and ways in which we can respond. Many Black professionals have had interactions at work that hurt, that feel icky, feel off, or really cause us harm. And then after the experience, we're left asking ourselves, was that racist or not? So today we're so excited to be joined by Dr. Paris Jean, a counseling psychologist, assistant professor, healer, and author. Dr. Paris, share something with us that is not on your CV, but informs your work.
Okay. So I really enjoy art and like creativity. So I have lots of coloring books. In my office, I have coloring books. I try to do events where there's some type of creativity. So I think that that informs my work because I'm someone that I'll see a problem and I'll be like, okay, how can we creatively discover some type of solution or work towards some type of solution? And so I think for me, especially being in a position where I'm doing a lot of research and kind of talking about things that are not necessarily like the facts, but also like being in that kind of research mindset. I think it's important to also have that creativity balance. And so for me, doing things like coloring, drawing, graphic design really helps me get creative. And then I think that also comes into my research too, where I'm not just trying to like, how have people always done it, but what are some other ways we might be able to do things?
I love that. And I really connect to that as well. Awesome. So we're excited to get started in our conversation. Of course, we'll start with like a little bit of context. Dr. Paris, you're the expert here, so jump in, and Karen, please feel to add in as well. So one thing I wanted to say before we move forward in our conversation for our listeners, what we are not doing on our pod today is debating or interrogating whether or not racism exists. So we are sort of acknowledging some things as truth and fact. So a couple of those things are anti-Blackness and racism. So want to name that. And then I also wanted to, of course, define what we mean by racism and specifically in the workplace. So the definition that we have here, and Dr. Paris and Karen, feel free to add to this. We have that at work, racism is typically more subtle and could take the form of microaggressions, being ignored, being invalidated or talked over, being overly criticized, or having assumptions made about your abilities. Over time, racist experiences make Black employees feel disempowered, hurt, and unsure of what to do next. These experiences also deteriorate mental health and well-being, job satisfaction, etc. Anything else that you all want to add to that definition?
I think that's a great summary of it. And I think maybe I would add, as we're talking about Black folks, is that it can really be very specific to the stereotypes and kind of systemic nature of how Black folks are treated in this country. And so racism, I think sometimes we use it as a broad term, but it's also really important to talk about how it manifests differently for different racial groups based on the kind of history they have in the United States, especially if we're talking about the U.S. context.
Yes. That's a great addition. And I know in your book, you gave specific examples of like stereotypes and tropes that Black people specifically experience. The other sort of like piece of context before we dive into our discussion and talk about your framework that you created was a report called Being Black in Corporate America, where they found that the majority of Black professionals have experienced prejudice at work. 58% compared to 15% of white professionals. Black professionals also experience microaggressions at higher rates. Those range from colleagues touching their hair without permission, being excluded from meetings related to their job, or having others take credit for their ideas, being mistaken for someone else of the same race, and colleagues using generally insensitive language. Their report also found that Black employees are 30% more likely to intend to leave their current company within 2 years compared to white employees. Those are some additional examples of what anti-Black racism can look like in the workplace. And to hear that statistic of almost 60% of Black professionals are experiencing those things, and a third of Black professionals thinking about leaving their company within 2 years, we know that it not only has an impact on folks like mental health, but really on their career trajectories. So let's get into the conversation. Would love to hear your sort of like journey, how you created this framework, this SNAPS framework, and your experiences with, anti-Black racism in the workplace.
Sure. So I developed this decision-making model. It was my dissertation. And it really came from my own experiences, but also the experiences of people around me. So I went to an HBCU, so historically Black college or university. I had a great time, and I think that HBCUs really foster and support your foundational confidence as a Black person, right? Going from that environment to then going to a predominantly white institution for my doctoral program that was also in the South, I had a lot of culture shock, right? So obviously, I had experienced racism before. I was aware of racism, right? But I had that 4 year reprieve. And so, also coming from an undergraduate institution straight into a doctoral program, there was also that transition in like professional identity, right? Like going from like a student where things are kind of more an undergrad student where things are kind of more said to you, to being in a doctoral program where it's a lot more like discussion based and there's like a little bit more blurring of the lines in terms of people's relationships and interactions with you. And so when I got there, I was experiencing a lot of racism within the program from cohort members, from other faculty, but then also in my daily interactions as well, because like I said, I was in the South. And growing up north, racism kind of looks a little bit differently. And so I really also didn't know much about Florida. So I thought it was just Disney World. So when I got there and there were palm trees, but Mickey Mouse was not there, and there was not, and it was very different than what I kind of thought about Florida. And so when I was in the program experiencing this racism, there's this other piece of being trained as a clinician, so specifically like as a therapist, where we would also be evaluated in class based on how we responded to our cohort members. So you might have someone say something extremely anti-Black, and then what would happen was the professor would then expect me to have a professional response when that person was being extremely unprofessional and being racist. And so a lot of times I would be talking to the other Black people in cohorts above me about how they navigated certain classes, how they navigated certain forms of evaluation that also could show some anti-Black bias, right? They would often say things like, you all are not as vulnerable as everyone else, right? But we're not in a safe environment to be vulnerable. So why would I be sharing personal details? And so I would strategize with the other Black folks about how we can kind of display those skills while also protecting ourselves. And what I noticed was I was having those conversations as I was early in my program, but then as newer folks would come in from cohorts below me, I was then taking on that role of having those same conversations with them. And it just kept being the same thing over and over again. And so I started to think, what if we had a model that really outlined all of these conversations that we are having, all of the considerations that we're making, and how those considerations are unique because we're in a kind of graduate professional space. Similarly, I had friends who also went to the HBCU with me, but maybe went right into like corporate America or industry and things like that. And they were having similar experiences as well, where they had this confidence that we got from our HBCU, but then the people that we were interacting with were still putting these anti-Black stereotypes onto us, and then we were being expected to respond a certain way. And so I started to think, okay, let's make this model for grad students and early career professionals. And so that's what I decided to focus my dissertation on, and being able to create a model that then people could work through before they experience racism or even while they're experiencing it, so that they don't have to feel like they have to think of all this stuff on the spot. It's kind of already outlined for them.
Yeah. And you said something that I think I have known to be sort of like implicitly, but maybe have not
Mhm.
heard it explicitly in that way, but that racism is unprofessional.
Mm.
And I think I have not heard people talk about it in that way, which is important, right? I think
Mhm.
sometimes I've heard people give sort of like these carve outs for like, oh, but they're a good person and just made a
Mhm.
mistake in ways
Mhm.
that for other unprofessional behaviors, there would not be exceptions made. So I really appreciate that framing.
Yeah, and I also want to add like professionalism, especially in like the United States context, has been weaponized against Black folks, right? And so a lot of times the reason why, I mean, we can excuse racism, but we can't excuse unprofessionalism is because in a lot of people's minds, racism is not a non-negotiable because it's embedded into our society, right? And so being able to like as a Black person know, no, if we're gonna go by what you all want to define professionalism as, being racist towards your colleague is unprofessional, and it's important to kind of name that. So yeah.
Yeah. I also think there is an emotional aspect to when we talk about like racism and especially being a Black person impacted by that. There are times where you have, well, I know that I've questioned, like, well, was that racist? Like, it definitely felt bad, but
Mhm.
does it rise to the category of being racist? And I feel like a lot of times at work, we are usually conditioned to minimize our feelings. And so I think that it makes it even easier to dismiss like someone being racist because, to your point, we don't think about racism being unprofessional, but
Yeah.
more so a feeling of like, it didn't feel that way to me. And it's like,
Mm.
that shouldn't be the threshold that we're usually using to measure whether that was racist or not.
And to that end, I would love your thoughts, Dr. Paris, on is it important to sort of spend a lot of time on like let me google a definition of racism and like
Mm.
unpack the details of the incident and then say does this categorically fit within the definition of or yeah how would you recommend people sort of navigate identifying an in
Yeah, I think that I would reframe it from is it important to thinking about the impact that it's having on you. So we know from research, like perceived racism still can have an impact on folks and can still lead to racial trauma. And racism is very nuanced. So there is like the kind of very overt forms of racism where most people might agree that that's racist, right? But then a lot of times it can also be more covert. It can be more subtle, and so when you're thinking about is this racist, is it not, it could be helpful to look up different definitions of racism, especially if you kind of only have been really taught the more overt definitions of it. But I also think that it's important to think about what is the impact on you, right? So say I'll give an as a Black woman, right? Sometimes it's hard for us to decide is somebody being racist, are they being sexist, are they being both, or is something else going on, right? And you can kind of continue to go round and round about like which one is it, so on and so forth. But then what is the overall effect of that, right? I don't feel safe with this person. This person is negatively impacting me. Okay. So rather than spending too much time trying to like place it in a category, you might want to be like, okay, well, this is the effect it's having on me. This is how I'm perceiving it. So now what do I want to do to preserve my own wellness and to get through this situation? So I think that there is value in knowing the different definitions of racism. And I think that it's important to not negate what the effect of something might be for you and how that's going to impact how you show up in that environment, how you feel afterwards. And I think that also when we are in these workplaces, a lot of times we're one of the only people, or there's maybe a couple other folks. And so that also can make it hard for us to determine if something is racism because you don't have another Black person to be like, yeah, that was super racist, right? And so then you kind of feel like, well, everyone else is acting like this is normal, so it must be me. And so I would encourage folks to kind of resist that tendency to go into self-blame. And that's one of the reasons I created the workbook, was that even if you are one of the only people in a particular environment, this workbook is a culmination of like research and focus groups with other Black folks talking about their experiences, so that even if you're not getting validated by maybe someone in your workplace, you can have some of that validation as you're reading through the workbook and kind of get some support that way.
Awesome. So take us through the the framework. If you can give us like
Mhm.
high level cliff notes for folks who haven't yet read the book. What is the SNAPS model?
Sure. So SNAP stands for Strategically Navigating Anti-Black Racism in Professional Spaces. So that's a mouthful, so you can see why that would be that acronym. So essentially, with the model, it's not telling you what the right response is, right? I talk about in the book where Black folks throughout history have had different responses to the anti-Black racism that we experience. And sometimes people might be like, oh, well, this is a better or worse response. But a lot of times it has to deal with the kind of context, the social identities of the folks that are making those decisions. And so the decision making model really is 8 considerations that folks can go through when they're thinking about how they want to respond. So at the core of the model is knowledge of self, which is a really important part of Black psychology. And this piece about knowing who you really are, not who capitalism tells you you are, not who white folks say is important or what your workplace says is important, but like who are you really at your core? What are your values? And then that being kind of the compass that allows you to address the other components of the model. And so some of the pieces of the model that you would consider is like assessing your emotional and mental well being, right, at that moment. So there are different times in our lives where we have more or less emotional and mental capacity to respond to certain forms of racism, right? So, for example, we were talking about being sick, right? If I'm super sick, I am trying to, my daughter's going through a sleep regression, all those different things. If I come to work and someone has decided that they are going to touch my hair or say something ridiculous in a meeting, how I respond when I have all of that going on in the background might be very different than when I just got back from like a wellness retreat and I'm feeling like centered and I have more capacity to maybe have a conversation about that, right? And so the model is really about thinking about those types of considerations so that you can make a decision about how you want to respond that centers what's best for you rather than centering what's best for like the perpetrator of racism. And a lot of times for Black folks, sometimes we are taught to center whiteness and center what's best for white folks. So we
Yeah.
might stretch ourselves thin trying to explain to everybody anti-Black racism, knowing good and well they know how whiteness and racism works, but we're centering their desire to learn when in reality it's like at our expense, right? But
Yeah.
then there might be a time where you do have more capacity for that, and then that is something that feels meaningful for you. So it's really about folks being able to sit with themselves and think about a response that is going to allow them to feel like they did the best they could with the information that they had in that moment. And it obviously does not guarantee how other people are going to react to that, but it allows you to feel like, okay, I was able to think through all of these different components.
Yeah. I really love your model because I know that when these types of interactions happen at work, it can send us into like a fight, flight, or freeze mode.
Hmm.
And I know I've had experiences where it's like something will happen. I'll respond however I'll respond in the moment. And then as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, dang, I should have said this or I should have did that or, something like that. And I think at least being aware of your decision making model can help to unpack past experiences that then can help, think about if I and when I interact with something like this in the future, what do I want to do? And at least having a framework that centers me and my well being first, I think is really important.
And I love that it's also dynamic in that it is based on you as an individual and also in that moment in time. Because I also think that sometimes people can express like, oh, there is a right way to respond to a thing, or maybe like
Hmm.
judge others or judge ourselves to say like, I saw that this person didn't say anything, so that means maybe I shouldn't say anything. I think like the dynamic nature of the model allows you to say like that individual had their response and
Hmm.
I can have something different.
Yeah, and everybody is different and everyone has there's, all these 8 considerations, right? Like for depending on the person and the circumstances, different ones are going to be like more or less priority, right? So, when I was doing the focus groups, there were folks that were like, "Hey, I can help black people more when I get this degree. So I'm gonna just kind of move around this, and that's not gonna be my priority right now is addressing all this racism. I'm just gonna kind of move through this." And then there were other folks that were like, I won't feel good if I don't address this right now, if I don't make this environment better for Black people right now. And there can be a temptation to try to judge either one of those responses. But in reality, it's just folks making decisions based on who they are, what they value, and the kind of needs of the circumstance they're in at that moment.
I do, Dr. Paris. I am interested to hear in your perspective because in preparing for our discussion, I have been thinking about my own experiences with racism at work or in other places. For me, they most frequently happened when I was in predominantly like white spaces. So
Hmm.
I went to PWI for undergrad and for grad school. I've worked in workplaces that had predominantly like white folks on staff. And I've worked in workplaces where it was much more diverse. And it's not to say that like it's exclusively happens in predominantly white spaces, but I'm just curious from your perspective, do you feel like being in predominantly white spaces helps to like exasperate or amplify the likelihood that that happens, or do you feel like people can still have interactions with like anti-blackness even in diverse environments or all black environments?
Yeah. So with anti-Black racism, right, we can all perpetuate anti-Black racism. And sometimes when we're maybe in an all-Black environment or in a more diverse environment, that anti-Black racism may manifest in things like colorism, texturism, featureism, right? It might be some of these more not nec- subtle ways that we try to create another hierarchy, right? Because within anti-Black racism, there is that hierarchy, right, of Black folks being at the bottom, and then folks that have features or physically look closer to what society considers Black, right, is are seen as less than. And so I think it can manifest in many spaces because at the end of the day, the water that we're all kind of swimming in is anti-Black racism, capitalism, white supremacy. So it definitely can show up in those spaces, but I think it looks different. And so it's really about being able to kind of name when those things are happening. So I mentioned that I went to an HBCU, right? So I necessarily wasn't having a white person come and like touch my hair, right? But I did see how like things like colorism would show up or how things like respectability politics might show up, right? And so those are manifestations of anti-Black racism, right? But then the people that are, maybe enacting it are not white folks, right? So I think it looks different depending on the environment, but I'll also say when you are in the, I think when you are in environments that are more diverse, people also might be a little bit more open to having conversations about it. Whereas with like kind of the culture of whiteness is not to talk about uncomfortable topics, and racism is considered an uncomfortable topic. So I think that it can happen anywhere, just because of how we're all socialized. And I think that there it might be a little bit more willingness for people to address some of those things when you are in more diverse environments, at least from my experience and kind of what I've observed with others.
That's a perfect segue to our do that or don't do that segment because my first do that or don't do that is, are we calling people racist, using the word racist at work in corporate environments? And I ask that because I used to work in higher ed, and I think the academic understanding of language and people's ability to use certain types of language just looks different.
Mm.
Even their understanding of terminology, right, is different. So yeah, are we calling people racist at work?
This for you.
That or not?
So I'm just supposed to say just don't or do, or
Yeah,
can I explain?
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, I say do. But more so in if that's helping you kind of how to process and categorize the person. I think realistically, being in a meeting telling someone, "Hey, you're a racist," and like, walking out the room might make things uncomfortable, right? Um, but I think that being open to saying, like, maybe even internally or amongst other safe people, like, that person is racist can also, like, validate yourself and also allow you to know what category to put that person in, right? So, like, sometimes people are afraid of being like, "Oh, that person is racist." They'll be like, "Oh, no, maybe they're, they didn't mean it like that," so on and so forth, and then we go through all the mental gymnastics. So, I would say do that in terms of identifying safe and unsafe people in the workplace, but maybe don't do that right to their face unless they ask me.
It's a good do that or don't do that. To your point, Dr. Paris, it depends on how much you're willing to risk. Like, if you want to stand 10 toes down on you are racist and be prepared for what comes next, then hey, you know, be ready so you don't have to, or stay ready so you don't have to get ready.
Mhm.
That's so funny.
Okay, my do that or don't do that is do that or don't do that. Should you give someone a nickname or different name because their birth given name is difficult for you to say?
I say don't do that. But then the nuance is seeing what that person actually wants to be called because I've had situations like that with like maybe students or folks I've been working with where I'm like, "No, I want to learn how to say your name." And they're just like, "Actually, it makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to do that." So, I would say don't do that as a general kind of without seeing what the person actually prefers and holding space for them to talk through what they actually prefer, like not just being like, "Okay, what do you prefer?" And they'll probably say, "I just prefer that nickname." Actually hold the space of like, "Do you really prefer that, or is that just what you've been saying?" So yeah.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
I
Plus,
asked that question just because I had a friend who um, gave himself a nickname that was like because people were challenged by saying his first name. And he told me that like this started early on in his childhood at the age of being like kindergarten, grade school. And I'm like, this, it just broke my heart to be like, you are having to simplify like your actual name just one so you can stop explaining or trying to like get people to pronounce your name correctly. And to me, that is like the most sign of just respecting someone's like humanity is being able to get their name right. And so I think a lot of folks have experiences with just names and nicknames and all of the things.
yes. And I wish more people would correct others. I think that as someone who has a name that is challenging for people, curiously challenging for people, I would offer that the thing that is most tiring is having to do it so much. It's like at Starbucks, like by the time I got to work, it's like I've had to correct like 12 people. So like maybe the 15th person, I'm going to let it slide because it's like I'm just tired. So it'd be great if like the collective community could be like, oh, by the way, her name is Ani. Like I welcome that,
Mhm.
by the
I
way.
always get sometimes, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's my name." "Are you sure? Are you
I-
sure it's spelled like that?" "I am."
Yeah. Okay. My do that or don't do that. My next one is do you do that or don't do that? Share your honest perspective if another Black person asks you your honest opinion about a former company that you worked at or a former boss that you worked for.
Would do that. Again, another I feel like I'm bad at this because 'cause I'm like, caveat." But, I would say if I have a close enough relationship with that person or I'm at a point where I don't feel like if they were to tell that person that it would, like, blow back on me. Because I say this because when I was in grad school, that would kinda be a situation where sometimes you might tell an applicant, like, "Don't come here," and then they go tell the school or the advisor, "I mean, they told me don't come here," and it's like, "Well, no, gotta deal with that, right?" So I would say if you really don't care about that happening or you feel like that person will like actually take what you're saying and like make an informed decision, I would say it's definitely helpful to tell folks that because when you don't, then they might like take that position and then it ends up being very harmful.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm going to spill the tea and share my experience. And I will also say to your point, Dr. Paris, my caveat is like, don't over identify with my experience because it is unique to
Mhm.
me. But I think it can be helpful data in terms of your decision making process.
Yeah. I have found in practice, nobody listens, but I am always happy. Everyone is like, I'm still going to take the job. I'm like, okay, good luck.
And I get that, right? Because it's like, if you don't have any alternative, choice, then it's at least you're not walking in blindly. I can have
Sure.
your experience as
And I
information,
would
so I'm not
say
walking in with rose-colored glasses.
there are like I don't want to say there's few places that are not racist, but I think sometimes people hear that and they're like, okay, I mean, the last place I was at is like, so it's really about, I guess, what racist place you feel most comfortable at, and I guess that's different for everyone, or you find a unicorn.
That's a word.
Okay, my do that or don't do that is, should you report instances of either microaggression or anti-Blackness or things that feel racist to HR?
Okay. Okay. Well, let me just say. So I think that there can be misconceptions about what HR is and is not. And I think that sometimes folks get really disappointed when they think that HR is like going to fix the problem for them versus like protect the company, right? So I think that you can, and you might want to have some other things lined up that are going to help protect you, because if you solely try to go through HR, they may not do everything you're hoping that they would do because they ultimately are also a part of the company.
Yeah. I would say, HR enforces law and policy and can only do that so far as the law and policy go. So if
Mhm.
it is not illegal to be racist and there is no policy against certain things, I mean, I think sometimes you can loosely say maybe this is like a business ethics issue or like a harassment, broadly harassment. But for some things that are more nuanced, it can be challenging. And that is if you have someone in HR who is like willing to go the bat and is not racist themselves, right? So Um, okay, let's do one more before we do our final thoughts. Do that or don't do that. Hire a Black candidate just because they're Black to sort of balance out a team.
I'm really bad at this. I think that at least in the society we're in, it's very rare that people just hire a Black person just because they're Black. Usually they have the qualifications and there might be a need for diversity. So I think that that can be beneficial, but you also want to be mindful of the environment you're putting that person in, because I think sometimes people be like, "Oh, well, we need more Black folks," but it's like, is your workplace prepared for a Black person to be there, or are you just signing someone up to get traumatized because y'all haven't done the work? You just want a Black person to kind of fill a quota. So I would say don't do that unless you're actually prepared for what it means to have a Black person as a part of your team and you're prepared to like support and treat that Black person well.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yes, I love that. And I will also say, generally, don't do that. And also, Black people are qualified. I think in my work as an equity and inclusion practitioner, like if I had some money every time I heard a person say, like, we want the best and most qualified candidate, it's like, well, Black people are the best and most qualified candidate. So that's great. You're not losing out on anything. So yeah, I'd be rich by now.
Yeah. I actually kind of feel the opposite in that no, I agree with what you're saying. I don't feel the opposite on that. I feel like a lot of people are mid. And I feel like we are never having a conversation about best and brightest and top and most, whatever. We allow room for learning on the job and growth and potential for a lot of people, except for Black people, right? So I'm like, thumbs up. If you got room to grow, we'd love to see it. Everyone here does.
That's
Mhm.
true. That is something I think about sometimes too. Like I feel like as Black folks, we either have to excel or nothing, right? And it's like everybody else gets to. There are some folks that are just average, and like that's totally fine with everybody. So
Yes.
I mean, true equity might be like let us be average too, right? Let's just be.
Yes. Like everybody is not going to be the top whatever. So it's like, that's fine. Cause I would say not even some, most people are average.
Yeah.
Most.
Yeah, statistically, yeah.
That's what it is.
And I've seen experiences where someone was less than average and still, yet and
Rising to
still.
the top.
Okay. Yes.
Last do that or don't do that, Karen.
No, that was my final one. I'm all good. Yeah.
All right. So
That
let's
was
move
fun.
into final thoughts, final takeaways. We'll start with Karen and then I'll go and then we'll end with you, Dr. Paris.
Oh. My final takeaway is really just utilizing Dr. Paris's framework. I loved it because the idea of like centering yourself for me is just something that resonated so deeply because we are conditioned as Black folks to do the opposite. And so it even feels like a new and foreign practice to be like, well, how did that impact me? What capacity do I have to respond to it? And taking ownership of an experience that feels yucky, feels demeaning, makes you feel fragile or vulnerable, and caring for yourself, I think, is what I really love. So I would just encourage folks to take advantage of the beautiful framework that you've developed for us as Black folks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that was really mine as well. Like how important it is to know yourself, your goals, your vision, like the things that trigger you, and knowing yourself in the current moment as well, because there really is no one best way to navigate all of this. And then also just thinking about how racism doesn't just shape our experiences, it can shape our identity. So, to your point, Karen, like thinking about who we are, not just in response to, but outside of, those broader systems. So,
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate y'all's reflections and also you all finding the decision-making model helpful and like applicable. I would say remembering that you should not have to experience all of this, right? So I get a lot of feedback, especially from non-Black folks who are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you all had to think this much about things, right? And a lot of what's described in the model are things that people already do, but they're not writing it down, right? And they haven't seen it all just kind of laid out in that way. And so recognizing that that is a lot of emotional labor that we often have to do every day, and recognizing that we should not have to deal with that. And my big hope and dream one day is that this model would be completely obsolete because Black folks don't have to do all of that to survive and thrive in our workplaces. And I would also say just building community, finding your people. So there's a lot of inner work that we get to do, but also being able to find community if you don't have that at your workplace, thinking about professional organizations that are geared towards Black folks, thinking about community organizations you can join, family, friends, because white supremacy really thrives when marginalized folks isolate themselves, right? Because we're more powerful as a collective. And so I'd really encourage folks to be intentional about finding that community as you navigate these situations.
That Well, Dr. Paris, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. I know it's been a long time coming, so thank you for making time. And for our listeners, just a few reminders. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please share it with a colleague or your people that you think would find it helpful. You can also leave us a review. It really does help to boost our engagement on the podcast. We ask that you also follow the podcast if you haven't already. And if you'd like to reach Ani and I directly, feel free to email us at the don't do that pod@gmail.com. And Dr. Paris, just want to, if there's any way that you want to give a shout out of like where folks can either contact you or if you have any upcoming projects that you like to plug, feel free to do so right now.
Sure. So you can find me at www.drparisjean.com. That has like links to my social media, things like that. I really try to be active on Instagram. So if you want to connect with me on there, it's Paris Jean PhD, and you kind of be able to see like upcoming events and activities and things like that, as well as links to the book and also the journal article about the decision making model.
And we will make sure to leave all of your information in the show notes as well for folks. Well, I think that wraps us up today. So until next time, you all remember, don't do that.